Welcome back. Welcome to part 3 of our screencast looking at the idea of world culture versus a global agenda. And when we left off last time, we were talking about basically where are we now? Where are we in terms of globalization and contextualization? We've just been talking about INGOs, IGOs, the way they're connected, the way that supranational organizations work with nation states in order to develop networks, and the multiple ways that those networks are associated with one another and impact what happens in real education systems and real schools and real classrooms on the ground. Or at least we were getting that direction. And if we look at Lechner and Bolai's comment on page 293 of the Globalization Reader, they say that we therefore find a complex and highly decentralized global governance structure that involves much cooperation among civil society INGOs, IGOs led by the UN and states, but also, and this is key, much divisiveness, disagreement, and controversy about specific policies, programs, and lines of development in many domains. So the point is that there is a complex and highly decentralized global governance structure. It requires a lot of cooperation among civil society INGOs, IGOs, and states, but that there's actually no real cohesiveness to that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why it's so decentralized. And so they make the point, and note that I have added the emphasis, that's why it's in italics and bold. But they make the observation that global consensus is often hard to reach, but the globalization of issues, the degree to which issues and policies are debated and settled at the global level, is continuously on the rise. Now again, this is back to this idea of what is a world culture versus this idea that we also see a lot of divisiveness, controversy, disagreement, that we see all sorts of problems with coming together around one solid idea or ideology or movement forward. And what Lechner and Bolai are arguing is that this globalization of issues is really where the world culture can come from when we're talking about education or any other institution for that matter. And they make, I think, a really strong point. And so let's look at a couple of the issues that have been globalized, but the ways that they are differently enacted or addressed or conceptualized in IGOs or INGOs or in states or at local levels. And as we move towards that, let's take a look excuse me, at what, first of all, in the Bolai and Thomas chapter, which is pages 306 to 312 in your Globalization Reader, they point out that INGOs and world culture interact in an interesting way. They say that almost all INGOs originate and persist via voluntary action by individual actors. So INGOs have explicit, rationalized goals. Right? And the key idea here is rationalized. It does not mean that they are correct or true. It means that, or necessarily even rational, but they are rationalized. They have been explained or developed in a way that seems logical or seems appropriate and can be justified, perhaps even with evidence. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the best, the right, or the true ways. So INGOs have explicit rationalized goals. They operate under strong norms of open membership and democratic decision making. They seek in a general sense to spread progress, and you'll notice they have the quotes around that, throughout the world, to encourage safer and more efficient technical systems, more powerful knowledge structures, better care of the body, friendly competition, and fair play. Right? These are all, by the way, we could argue Western ideals or Western values. Not that they don't exist elsewhere, but that would be a moniker we could place on them. They say to achieve their goals, they emphasize communication, knowledge, consensual values in decision-making, and individual commitment. These are basic principles that underlie INGO ideologies, and they include universalism, individualism, rational voluntaristic authority, human purposes of rationalizing progress, and world citizenship. And they go into more description about each of those basic principles if you look at the chapter. I'm not gonna do that here. What's important, however, is that one of the globalized issues is this approach of INGOs, this approach about spreading progress. Now again, it's a rationalized goal. That doesn't make it the best or the correct or the right goal. And that is part of the understanding about world culture. It is a way of embedding shared expectations, shared ideologies, shared perspectives, shared structures for doing things, even though it may not necessarily fit the local context or community or infrastructure where it's being implemented. Right? So that's key. That there's this there's a different type of coupling between the world culture and the local conditions that will exist in every different place. So we have, first of all, this idea that the globalization of issues, we can look at the broader sense and say INGOs have a particular approach that they are using, which can be characterized as originating from more of a Western ideology. They're going to take some of that development ideology with them into whatever context they're working in. And that ideology, that expectation about what INGOs do and how they do it is an issue that has been globalized. Excuse me. Keep sniffing. Sorry for the cold. Next, if we look at Nitsa Berkovich's chapter, which you'll see the page numbers here in the Globalization Reader, she talks specifically about the rise of new global rules and expectations related to women after World War II. And she points out that there is a new ideology that arose calling for women's full equality, political equality, social equality, economic equality, right? Full equality. And she said that women's INGOs rapidly grow and expand, and that both globalizes as well as divides the rules and expectations and ideologies about what women's issues are and how women's full equality can be achieved. Right? So what is the global issue? What is the issue that has been globalized here? Right? Well, that's pretty easy. One, it's women's equality. Right? But the way that is conceptualized, or the way that that's going to be implemented, is actually quite divided. Right? Because there are different expectations for women in highly industrialized, wealthy Western countries, and women that are in lean economies, that are in places where the economy itself or industry in that community has not developed in the same way or to the same degree that it has in other countries, or that there are more or less emphases in education or other institutions on traditional values, right? And so you will find that the women themselves from different parts around the world are conceptualizing what women's full equality is in different ways. And oftentimes they will contradict one another even, and that's interesting. So the idea is that women's full equality as an issue has been globalized. But the ways that is being addressed, even by women themselves in different communities around the world, is actually quite divided in terms of what are the rules, what are the expectations, what are the underlying ideologies for how that should develop. We can also look at Elizabeth Boyle's chapter on female genital mutilation, or I think she calls it cutting. We can call it FGM. She calls it FGC. And she points out that this originally became an issue because concern arose among feminist Westerners who were concerned about what was happening and concerned about it from I guess a cultural perspective, but that they redefined it as a medical problem. And when they redefined it as a medical problem, addressing it as a medical problem became legitimized by the World Health Organization. And they also embedded FGM in issues of women's rights, that women's rights and the right to not be mutilated in that way came up, women's rights as human rights. And that has recast FGM as a human rights issue. So the issue itself that has been globalized is female genital mutilation, right? And that it's a concern and a problem. But the way that it was then enacted, the way that it was developed beyond that, was very much manipulated by Westerners in particular, who found that the best way or the most effective way for them to get the kind of change that they were looking for, or the kind of response and regulation related to FGM that they were looking for, was to redefine it as a medical problem get it legitimized with the World Health Organization, one of these supranational organizations, and recast it as a human rights issue. Right? It doesn't mean that everybody necessarily takes the same approach, but you can see that the way that the issue was globalized is somewhat manipulable. Okay. If we look at Michael Bond's chapter in the Globalization Reader, he talks about backlash against international non-governmental organizations. And he says that basically as INGOs became more and more prevalent and expanded and became more and more important in terms of developing civil society and influencing the way that states were developing policies and enacting them, more people began to recognize their impact worldwide. And as more people gain recognition of what they're doing, more critics arise. And very rightly so in many cases, have charged INGOs with being self-interested, single-minded, not accountable, of fostering dependence, of implementing unsustainable practices, etc. And so the idea was, INGOs have usually a very specific mission or agenda, and we talked about what that was here, right? These rationalized goals about progress throughout the world based on a set of largely and easily identified Western values. And Bond's approach, or Bond's response was, you know what, INGOs have a hard time compromising that ideology, compromising that globalized issue related to INGOs to work with states who might not share those same values or might not align with that same ideology. So if an INGO wants to implement a particular program in Botswana, and the Botswanan government doesn't agree with the way that INGO wants to implement it, that's a problem, right? Because the INGOs need the government in order to have the resources and the legal legitimacy to do what they want to do. So do the INGOs compromise that globalized ideology here, or do they stick with it? That's one of the big issues now related to global governance. And then finally we have, I wanted to focus on the Chantoki, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, article or chapter in the Lecter and Bolai Reader, asking if global civil society was actually global. And she points out, global civil society is largely dominated by Western-based INGOs. And there's this Western bias on civil and political human rights, much less on social and economic rights. And if we look back at the two global issues that I pointed out, the global women's movement and related to that female genital mutilation, those are largely civil and political human issues. Those are not so much economic rights. And so she's saying that there are a lot of countries, especially lean economies, who are very interested in economic rights development and in economic development overall, and that's being ignored by Western-based INGOs in favor of this civil, in other words, in favor of establishing democracies, or in favor of making sure that there's full women's suffrage, or making sure that whatever it is. And she's saying that that's not really a global civil society anymore, because it's only representing the values and the interests of one sector of the world that dominates these INGOs that work with IGOs and then governments to make their policies sort of embedded in that country's system. So we can see that we're developing a little bit of a context where we have this idea of global consensus, yes, around globalized issues, but the degree to which the issues and policies are debated and settled is continually, definitely on the rise, but debated in that there's a lot of divisiveness, disagreement, and controversy about how these things are actually going to be implemented and developed. So we're left with a bit of conundrum. We have a globalization of issues at a larger level, but we also have a lot of division and a lot of contention and conflict about how that's going to be established. And what we see is then the rise of globalized issues, but the decentralization of the ways that they're being addressed or resisted or whatever it is. I hope this has helped think a little bit about world culture versus a global agenda, and will contribute to our discussion moving forward.